I swear to you all now that this story is true. I'm Canadian, but both my mother and father's parents and extended family all come from Sweden. We often visit the Scandinavian country to see friends and family, and when this happened, we were visiting my father's family. They live on the coast, in a small rural community of fishermen that I'm not willing to name here, but it's near the border with Norway. We were about a week into our stay. It wasn't abnormal for us to be here for a few months over summer and for us to return to school for the new academic year late. It was early morning and my grandpa, who was a fisherman, was leaving for his daily fishing routine, and me and my older brother, he was 12, I was 10, asked if we could go with him. Being the laid-back community it was, my grandpa worked for himself and agreed to have us on board his small vessel for the day. We geared up to face the harsh conditions of the Swedish weather and took the 5-minute walk to his boat and set off. Despite the size of his vessel, my grandpa was experienced enough and unafraid to go quite far out into the ocean. He claimed the bigger fish were this far out and that other fishermen rarely ventured out this far, but he never elaborated. Being excited little kids at sea, we thought little of it as our grandpa reeled in nets full of fresh fish for the markets, and as we played small games and ate sandwiches we had pre-packed. Now, the vessel was tiny, and had I been the age I am now, I would have been dubious about going this far out to sea on it. It was an old, shabby craft, paint peeled away to expose the semi-rotting wood of the boat. Barnacles clung to the bottom of it, and the boat was creaking regularly, even at the softest of waves. It was only 15 feet long and had no lower deck, having only a small cabin where the captain could control the boat. We had been out at sea for an hour or two, and the effect of it all had wore off on me and my brother. We were becoming fidgety and were eager to find something to do when my brother pointed towards the horizon. My grandpa was busy preparing some nets or something, so didn't take notice. I looked over to where my brother was pointing and saw a whale breaching the ocean. Except it wasn't a whale. It couldn't have been. Its flesh was red and white, like that of a crab. Its shape was all wrong. In fact, it had no discernible shape at all, and the scariest part was the tentacles. We barely saw them at first, but there was no denying the obvious appendages that writhed like cobras beneath the waves. It submerged and disappeared. Me and my brother were in awe. He went over to my grandpa and tried to gain his attention. He was having none of it. He was too busy trying to untangle some debris from one of his nets. His interest soon peaked as we noticed a black shadow creeping beneath the boat. Me, my grandpa, and my brother all went over to see a huge black mass, at least 5 times the size of the boat, rush underneath and go past us. My grandpa was in shock. We followed the shadow until it was barely visible due to the angle and lighting, when again the red mass breached. It was huge, far bigger than we had first thought, and its tentacles were easily 30 feet long. They lashed about in the cold ocean, and then this thing's face appeared. We only saw one jet black eye, like a massive, polished oval of obsidian, the size of a small car. This thing appeared to almost roll over, bearing rows of sharp teeth spiraling in circular rows. In a flash, a heap of disturbed seawater splashed up, and the thing disappeared beneath the waves. My grandpa sat unmoving as hot tears began to rush down my face. My brother was beginning to wail, and my grandpa quickly clamped a hand over his mouth and told him to shush. It was at least 10 minutes until he started up, and we headed straight back to land. At a later date, my granddad revealed that the creature could have been the fabled kraken, an infamous nautical monster that appears like a giant octopus, originally from Norwegian mythology. It could have been. We were in seas close to Norway. It could have been a giant squid. Either way, both are as spectacular to me as each other, and it's something that will stay with me for life. This is something that I experienced as a little kid, and it's something that I haven't really thought about much until recently. I grew up on a stead in rural Sweden, and for those of you from more populated countries, rural really does mean rural. So this farm was nestled in a valley in the south of the country, and we had a traditional home at the bottom, next to a lake. There, we grew crops and had small livestock such as chickens and rabbits. There was a thin dirt path that led up the hill that reached a flat spot which housed a barn and pigs and cows. It was quite a long walk away, especially if you were carrying water up to the animals, and it wasn't well lit or particularly safe at night. So, like I say, this occurred when I was a child. I'm close to 65 now, and back then, there was no internet to go googling anything we couldn't explain. It was early one autumn morning, and the ground was frozen and the air cold. As dawn approached, in the last slivers of darkness, I was trekking up the path towards the cows to feed them for the morning. I was tired, and the first morning run always took me a little longer than the rest, whilst I stretched out and fully woke myself up. I reached the enclosure and opened the gate to head towards the barn. I looked down to see that the grass was dead. The day before, it had been lush autumnal greens, and now it was black and withered. On the hillside next to me, outside of the enclosure, the grass was still green, if a little frost-covered. I trod carefully, seemingly in a parallel world devoid of life. I wasn't even in the barn when the stench hit, the disgusting stench of rotting meat and bad crops. I covered my nose and mouth, halting the attack on my senses as I approached the barn entrance. I lit the lantern that hung on an old rusty hook outside the barn, and cautiously entered. Terms like this are thrown around a lot in stories like this, but what I saw that morning when I entered the barn is like nothing that I have ever seen since. In one corner of the barn were all of the cows, at least 20 of them, huddled together like penguins, something I've never seen them do before. They seemed skittish and scared, and even shaking their feet wouldn't move them. My hairs stood on end at this particular sight. I turned to check the rest of the barn, and that's when I discovered the source of the unbearable stench. 3 cows, or rather, what was left of 3 cows. Their skin grey and tight to their bones, their eyes rotted out and the sockets occupied by maggots. They appeared to be in an advanced stage of decomposition, their insides exposed to the cool morning air, a feast for the maggots. 3 cows that had been alive and healthy yesterday now lay dead, rotten to the bone. I ran back out of the barn and began tolling the small bell that was next to the lantern hook, alerting my father to the trouble. As I did, I happened to glance further up the hill. I couldn't make her out super clearly, but climbing the hill was what appeared to be an old hag of a woman, hunched over, grey-skinned, clad in an entirely black gown. In one hand was a rake that she was using as a walking cane. She had disappeared by the time my father arrived, and after seeing the cattle, he was as scared as me and beckoned me home, ushering me back to the farmhouse quickly, constantly checking over his shoulder as we went. I never did tell him about the old woman. Something seemed so evil about her, and I was too terrified to even mention her. As I grew up and got older, I was told tales of Pester, an evil old hag who was the Black Plague personified. The Black Plague decimated all the Scandinavian countries, and Sweden was hit hard. Sometimes, when I think about that old woman, I wonder if who I saw was Pester. It may not have been, but I can't help but draw some stark similarities between the stories of her and the woman I saw that early morning. I was hiking in the forests of Norrland, which, when translated to English, is the Northlands, so, as you'd imagine, I was quite far north. I'm an American student who was travelling around the Nordic countries over summer break with two of my friends who weren't actually with me on this day, as we would occasionally split off and do our own things before meeting back up. It was early evening when this happened, and I was trekking back through the woods, heading back towards our camp, which was now about an hour and a half's walk away. I came across a stream and decided to pull over to collect some fresh water, relieve myself, then to just have a quick minute to catch my breath. I sat on a rock close to the stream and looked up at the darkness creeping in as the sun receded over the trees. The sound of the water rushing over stones and birds and critters in the undergrowth relaxed me. After a moment or so, I regained everything and began to set off. I was following this stream back towards my camp and couldn't help but notice that it was swelling in size. Before I knew it, I was on the banks of a small lake with a waterfall emptying into it from the mountainside above. I noticed some odd shape moving underneath the waterfall, but due to the liquid curtain, I couldn't make anything out. I stopped and strained a look and decided I'd quietly creep around to the other side of the lake to try and get to look at what was hiding beneath the waterfall. I was excited by the prospect of seeing some unknown native species of animal or finding something peculiar, but was also cautious about disturbing anything or anyone. As I rounded the lake, I saw, to my utter disbelief, that it was a topless man, really muscly, with long brown hair that was tattered but looked damn good. He was an attractive guy, like very attractive, and that coming from a male, and he was playing a violin. I later found out it may have been a fiddle. I mean, he was shredding that thing, eyes closed, moving fluidly through the water as he played. He must have been freezing in that water, but he seemed unfazed. I tried to get a closer look, and as cliche as it sounds, a twig broke underfoot. The guy stopped playing the fiddle and opened his eyes, locking onto me immediately. Everything went dead silent, as if I was deaf. The waterfall, the wind, even nature itself. The only thing reassuring me was that I could hear my own heart thumping in my chest. It was the most surreal experience any conscious person could hope to experience without the aid of narcotics. And I mean that. This guy looked at me quizzically, his sapphire blue eyes scanning over me. I began to edge back and he again began playing his fiddle. As if by magic, all the sounds of nature rushed back in a symphony of relief. He said something directly to me, but I think it was Swedish and I couldn't comprehend. I was obviously scared and didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I edge away slowly? Should I stay dead still? After a moment, this man seemed to scoff at me before twisting and disappearing, but not before revealing that it had a large, scaly tail as its bottom half. And I stood rooted to the spot for ages, trying to comprehend what had just happened to me. I was clearly in shock and was shaking. By the time I stumbled back to my camp, I was muttering incoherently. I tried to tell my friends, but they didn't believe me and were sure I had taken something. I can assure you, I hadn't. It took me some time to research this when I got back to the States, and from what I gather, it was a fisherman, known in Sweden as Strömkarlen. Basically, it's a water troll that's infamous for playing the fiddle. I have no doubt that the man I saw that day in the woods was a fisherman, something that, had I not seen for myself, would have been filed under the realms of the imaginary. One of the most popular urban legends in all of Sweden is that of the Silver Train, an old, unpainted aluminium metro train that was originally used to test new carts on the lines. It was in fact real, and gained the name Silverpilen or Silver Arrow. The thing is, the train was decommissioned in 1996, so why did I see it just over a month ago? I'm not the only one. People still claim to see it now, and believe me, it was a super surreal experience. Let me explain. I was travelling home from visiting my girlfriend. She basically lives on the other side of the city, and it was late at night, probably 10 or 11. I had gone to catch the metro back home and was waiting by the platform. It was quiet. No one was in sight. I was completely alone. I began to hear the screech of train on tracks and heard the scraping sound that conducted through the rails. My train was 15 minutes early. Get in. Before it arrived, a plume of fog or mist exited the tunnel preceding my train. I thought this odd, considering it was a clear, warm night when I first came into the station, and I just reasoned it must have been a bust pipe or some damage to the train itself. I was more focused on not falling onto the track. The fog began to clear as the artificial light penetrated through, and I found myself about to board the train. I stopped, my foot basically on the threshold. I craned my neck back almost comically to look at the door of the car. It was unpainted aluminium. I took a step back. Silverpilen was before my time, but the stories were something I'd grown up with. There was no mistaking it. I retracted further onto the platform, to which the train responded with a toot, which made me jump. The mist had now cleared, revealing the Silver Arrow in all its glory. I scanned the carts to see a few emotionless people scattered throughout. All seemed vacant, with glazed over looks in their eyes, and their skin seemed awfully pale and their hair straw-like. There was no certain demographic here. There were women, men, tall people, small people, fat people, skinny people, black people, white people. Yet they all had the same shabby appearance and the same glazed over looks. I jumped again as the train screeched into life and slowly pulled away from the platform. None of the people aboard seemed to notice me, instead staring into space beyond me as they passed by. I boarded my real train when it arrived, proving that that train shouldn't have been on the line at all. I even went to the extent of messaging the rail company, who informed me no train was on the line at that time. Freaky. I told my friends and family, and we all agree. It was the Silverpilen. Sweden is 70% woodland. It's a large country too, so who knows what could be lurking in the dense trees of the Swedish forests. This story was told to me by my grandfather, a serious man, who never told any other stories quite like this. All his stories were rooted in reality, and this was the exception. Every time he would tell this story to me, he almost had a look of embarrassment on his face, as if he was ashamed that he himself would buy into it. He recently died and was one of my closest friends, I figure I'd share his story here to add to his legacy. I feel like this is the story he most wanted to share with people but was always too scared to, so this is for my grandfather as much as it is for you guys. The story from here on out is from my grandfather's perspective, and I've done the best I can to translate the story from the last time he told it to me. I was hiking alone in Sweden. My grandfather never disclosed the exact location. It was the 1950s and I was young and free and had just got my first car. The world was a crazy place in the 50s and Sweden, to me anyway, was at the forefront of this exciting new era. It was summer and I had been travelling all over the country, taking in the beautiful sights and scenery of our country, sights and scenes I'd never be able to experience without a car. I was about a month into the trip and had been at this absolutely amazing lodge party with some random people I had met when I stumbled across their log cabin in the woods. As such, I was feeling rough and decided to take it easy and go fishing in a lake about a mile hike from this log cabin. I sold my gear and sat lakeside, sipping water and the occasional juice box I had and letting the fresh air and relaxation sort out my hangover. I sat there for hours, till past dark, and even once I'd packed my rod and tackle away, I still sat lakeside, drinking it all in, looking at the stars in the open sky and wondering whimsically about the creatures that call the lake their home. I honestly have no idea of the time, but it was late and due to my escapades the night before, I was super tired. I was going to set up camp by the lake. I'd spent all day out there, so why leave now? But the more I thought about it, the more I didn't want to stand out to any potential predators. I decided to go into the woods a bit where I found a small clearing, big enough for me and which still had a view of the lake from the trees. I didn't light a campfire. It wasn't my style. I very rarely, if ever, did. Now, for perspective, my tent was dark green and had no zips or even a door for that matter. It was basically hoisted up and was open-ended on one side and a wall at the far end. I had erected my tent to face a lakeside, so anything behind me, further in the forest, I was blind to, and it should have been blind to me. As is always the case, once I'd settled down to get some sleep, I was wide awake, so I decided to go for a wee. I went around the back of my tent against a tree that was close by. That's when I noticed it in the distance. An odd glow. A soft, green glow, like something that is glow in the dark. I crept around the trees silently to see what it was and caught a glimpse of something in the distance. There were two of these massive behemoth creatures walking between the trees of the woods. They were easily 10 to 15 feet tall and were covered in moss, grass and branches. For all I could tell, they were moving trees. It was as if they were wearing ghillie suits. They moved slowly and clumsily, breaking branches as they passed them, and they both looked similar facially. Their eyes were the source of the unnatural soft glow, and their ears were big and wide like wings. Their chins were fat and wide, and the only difference between the two were their noses. The one at the front had a droopy, elongated fat nose, and the one following had a sharp, pointy nose. I immediately slunk down into the dirt, my heartbeats rapid, my breathing fast and shallow. I followed them off into the distance until they seemed to merge with the darkness of the trees. I still didn't move for a while. I was excited. I knew I had just seen trolls. Being a Swede, I was told about them as a child growing up. Most Swedes were, but I don't think any of us put any stock into the real existence of them. Yet, there was two of them, no more than 50 feet away from me. And it changed my outlook on life that night. I was looking for adventure and discovery in my youth, and I think I found it that night. There are things bigger than you'd think, still lurking in the densest and most mysterious parts of the world's woods, jungles and oceans. And I feel honoured to have had a glimpse very few men ever get. I used to be a hiker, and a very experienced one at that. I easily had 20 plus years of experience and have had my fair share of creepy occurrences and things that I just cannot explain. This one though, is by far the most mysterious and definitely the creepiest. It was midwinter and I was hiking a few trails deep in the Swedish heartland. The trails were usually well defined and clear in the summer months, but during the winter snowstorms, it provided me with an excellent challenge. I was with two other people on the trip, a local who knew the area, and a close friend of mine whom I had hiked with thousands of times before. We set off from our log cabin retreat at around 6 AM. It had been snowing fiercely through the night and our guide contacted us at about 4 AM saying we may have to postpone, but fortunately the snow had eased up somewhat. Our guide still advised about going on the trail, suggesting the snow may pick up again later on. Me and my friend discussed it and decided to go ahead and do it, perhaps getting carried away with our experience. A few hours later, as it was approaching lunchtime, the snow had once again picked up and there was a torrent of white snow barreling down from the heavens. Visibility was basically non-existent. You could probably see about a foot or so ahead and it was freezing to the point my body was going numb. Over the sound of the wind, we decided to call it a day and head back early to get to the cabin before nightfall. Our guide was at the front, leading the way, then it was my friend, then me, trailing at the back. About 10 minutes after starting the descent back down the trail, I had this really oppressive, uneasy feeling, as if we were encroaching on some forbidden land and someone, or something, didn't want us there. I threw a worried glance over my shoulder and, to my utter horror, could see a large black shadow through the snowy fog. It appeared to be following us but wasn't moving. The hairs raised on my body, but I doubted myself and told myself it was some peculiar optical illusion. I kept my head forward and continued walking, my other two companions seemingly oblivious. A few more minutes passed, and though I had up until that point resisted the urge to look back, I couldn't help but glance over as all three of us heard what sounded to be something like a bear and a lion roaring at the same time. The horrifyingly cruel aspect of a bear roar mixed with the absolute power of a lion roar. It shook my very skeleton with a rumble. We all heard it, and I turned back now to see the shadow, even larger and even closer. This thing was humanoid, easily 20 feet tall, possibly more, and it was nearly as wide as it was tall, with hulking long arms. Our tour guide seemed most fearful, and he stood silently praying before telling us we should run. We did, which, let me tell you, running downhill blind in a snowstorm, it's no easy task. Being the apparent walking cliche I am, I slipped and fucking fell, twisting my ankle in the process and eating a mouthful of snow. My two companions came back and began dragging me down the hill, the shadow still looming in the fog. It couldn't have been an optical illusion. We had wrapped around the hillside by this point and it was still there, unmoved. Eventually, we made it back to our cabin and I sat by the fireplace whilst my friend tended my ankle. FYI, it wasn't even rolled. I had just hurt it a little bit. I was fine the next day. All the while, our tour guide was making me edgy as fuck as he kept cautiously looking out from behind drawn curtains and praying silently to himself. I asked him what it was we had seen and he told me it was a local legend from his farm. He told me he didn't know how far it stretched, but neighbouring farms had heard the tales too. He said it was an unknown creature that lurked on the hillside, only coming out in snowstorms to bring unwary travellers to their death. He admitted that he never believed it, that the tough conditions and poor preparation had always killed the travellers. Now he wasn't so sure. He said, according to the stories he had heard growing up, that it could mimic the voices of hikers missing from specific parties, so that if it had got me when I fell, it may have mimicked my voice to bait my friends in. He did tell me the name of it, but it was in Swedish, and over the years, I have forgotten. I don't even want to guess as to the name, to be honest, as I don't really want to unless I know for sure. I'll ask a friend who travelled with me and see if he remembers. If he does, I'll update the post. Either way, this local legend is not too dissimilar from that of the Big Grey Man of Ben MacDooey. Maybe there is some link between the two. This experience has made me believe in both, and although it terrifies me to the core, it excites me too. I was so alive that day, and every day since I am happy in the knowledge that there are things out there, things that we just don't know about. This story was handed down to me by my father. It's almost like a family heirloom. Ask anyone in my family and they, at some point or another, would have heard it. Whether it is genuinely true or not has been the debate of many family gatherings, and still to this day, we can't truly be sure. My great-grandfather died before I was born, but according to my granddad, my great-granddad was adamant it had happened till the day he died. I will tell you this story under the guise of it being true. I believe it, but I'll leave you to make your own decision. This is now told from the POV of my great-granddad, and it happened sometime back in the late 40s. I think it was 1948, back when he was 21. Oh, just before it starts, my family hail from and still live in Sweden, so this happened in the Swedish wilderness. Just thought I'd add a little depth to the story. Okay, here goes. I was working as a transporter, taking trees to be processed into paper at factories. I had a small truck that could only fit a small load per trip, and I could find myself driving 18 hours a day, picking up from different locations all over the north. When this happened, I had been working a long day, probably 11 hours without a break, and so, admittedly, was tired. It was late on and I had just picked up what would be my last load for the day. It was dark and I was driving a medium-sized heavy goods vehicle down narrow and improperly defined roads that were cutting through the forests. At some point along the way, I had become lost and had run out of road. This happened more than you'd think, as most of these roads had no names and road maps were good as a guide at best. I began to try reversing my truck out from the dead end. These narrow roads were the reason we used smaller trucks. Then was looking in my wing mirror when I saw something glistening from between the logs on the truck bed. I stopped, fearing it may have been cinder from a fire. I looked, but there appeared to be no flames or smoke. I continued reversing, and again, the same sort of glisten caught my eye. I decided I'd have to get out and investigate to see what it was. I stopped the vehicle, grabbed the flashlight that I kept on the seat next to me, and walked around to the back of the truck. There was no fire. It was something a lot stranger than that, I'll tell you. There, crawling in between the felled trees strapped to my truck, was a person. Except this person was no bigger than a robin. Honestly. Now I tried to get a good sight of the person, if that's what you'd call it, and I found it difficult given the lighting and the fact they kept hiding between the logs. From what I could see, it was a male, as he was naked and clearly had male genitals. It seemed to have quite skinny features and seemed nimble and light on its feet. I was in awe, but somehow managed to keep myself together and keep watching this curiosity. In my head, I was telling myself that I need to do something, maybe capture it. or find some way to attain evidence of it. Yet I found myself unable to function and unable to act on my mental commands. A few minutes passed and I had not seen this little man for some time. A wave of realism seemed to sweep over me as I realised where I was and that what I had seen actually happened. I turned to go back to the cabin of my truck. I had no idea what I was going to do, and off in the distance I saw a strange glow. It's very difficult to describe as I've never known anything quite like it. It was the glow of something that was glow in the dark, but the coloration of it was not green. It was a sort of blue, like a turquoise or an aquamarine. As if my night hadn't already been strange enough, I turned my flashlight off and gently trekked towards the glow, which was no more than 10 centimetres off the ground and was moving slowly across the forest floor. Was it some sort of animal I didn't know of? I was excited, believe it or not, momentarily forgetting about the tiny little person I'd seen. I reached the trunk of a tree nearby to the glow and watched quietly from around it. The glow was from some sort of weird fungus-like thing that was being carried by a tiny naked woman, the same size as the little man I had seen moments ago. Outstandingly, she was being followed by a trail of at least 50 or so other little people, all walking in unison. And I stood peering round the tree in shock and confusion. I had no idea to what I was seeing. I had no idea what to do. All of me wanted to genuinely shout out with excitement. This was groundbreaking. This was world-changing. My excitement clearly got the better of me, and I came out from behind the tree, thinking I may be able to communicate with them. As I did, the skittish little devils dispersed into the darkness of the forest floor, and the glow from the mushroom went out like a light bulb. I spent a short while searching the forest for them, but given their size, I knew they'd be long gone or expertly hidden. I left bewildered and in awe, barely processing anything else on the drive to the factory. I actually returned in the day about 3 days later, on a day off I had, to see if I could spot them. Some sort of dwelling or any proof of them whatsoever. I turned up nothing. Now, I was not drunk. Oh, on a side note, he didn't suffer from any mental illness we were aware of. Nor was I on any medication. I admit, I was tired, but what I saw in front of me was a real, physical, tangible creature. It was no trick of the mind. And that's his story. What do you guys think? Like I say, I believe it. From what I gather, he just never seemed like the sort of man to just make quirky stories like this up. And it's a one-off tale from all his years working in the forests of Sweden, in one line of work or another. Thanks for reading. Bonus story. I live in a cabin with my mum and dad in the north of Sweden. We are really far north in the province of Lapland, on the border with Norway and Finland. We live on a large patch of land in an extensive cabin that offers snowmobile rides to tourists in the winter season. As such, there is not much around us other than a few small hills and a small wooded area. I was 16 when this happened, and I am 17 now. I had a friend staying with me for 2 weeks whilst it was summer holidays, and since we rarely saw each other, he was my best friend when we lived in the city, and after we moved out here, I stayed in touch with him. Being privately schooled and living out in the middle of nowhere, it was difficult to make friends, and admittedly, he was one of my only. As I say, with our land being relatively empty, boredom was a huge pain in the ass, and after having him round for a week and having already been into town twice already, which isn't close and is just as boring, we were stumped with as what to do. The weather was quite nice, and we decided to walk around my parents' land. In the summer months up here, it was weird. Summer was, and still is for that matter, very very short, and the snow often doesn't fully melt. This was the case. We were walking around the land in long-sleeve t-shirts, yet were kicking snow as we walked. Crazy. We were walking by the tree line when my friend tapped me on the shoulder. "Hey, who's that?" he asked, pointing over to the lightly snow-capped hills about 350 feet away from us. I strained to see a figure stood on the hill. It wasn't my mum or my dad. Judging by the build, I'd say they were male, and he was kitted out in black pants and a thick black coat, the hood pulled up, obscuring any views of his face. The coat had a brown fur collar that was very thick, and this person was very clearly, and purposefully, looking at us. I was quite annoyed. This was private land. Being 16, I thought I was adult enough to deal with this on my own, and me and my friend began walking over. The man turned and walked down the hill on the other side, out of sight. I began shouting, "Hey, wait there!" We began running towards the hill and up it. Once we reached the peak, he had gone. No joke, there was nothing but open land up to the tree line, and he couldn't have made it there that quick, and there were no footprints in the snow that remained. He had vanished. I walked down the other side to investigate further and nearly fell into an open chasm in the side of the hill that had become exposed in the summer. I had never seen it before, and by the looks of it, this was the first summer it had been exposed. The ice was very thick and solid and had turned that almost blue shade that it usually attains with age. All the snow had not melted either, and it was roughly a 10-foot drop into the chasm, but it was padded by about 6 feet deep of snow. I lowered myself down and once inside looked at the intricate ice archways and smooth look the ice had to it. This place was man-made. I slid the rest of the way down the snow and saw there were 3 hallways. I called my friend down and walked down one. After a while, it opened up into an inner sanctum where there was an old rotting wooden chair and 3 sets of skeletal remains. There were rusted swords and the remains of decaying hide shields, and there was even one helmet. I was shocked. What was I seeing? My friend was just as shocked, and investigations of the other hallways yielded similar results. We climbed back out of this tomb and I told my parents immediately. Currently, it is in the process of having archaeologists prepare an excavation of the site, which, given the ancient history of it, has been a more difficult task than you'd think, gaining all the relevant planning permission and all. Last Christmas, that hill was cordoned off to tourists, and so far, this whole thing has been kept under wraps by the government. That's not a conspiracy, they genuinely have been keeping details and information on it hushed, due to the delicate nature of the site. As for the unidentified man, well, I've seen him twice since, on the same hill. The second time, it was the winter months, and I thought he was a tourist who had become lost in the dark. I reached the hill, not watching the figure constantly as, like I say, I assumed it was a lost tourist. I reached the hill and there was no one there, and in the deep, thick snow, was only my footprints leading up to the hill, and down. The second time was in the spring. The snow was still quite deep and I was walking around the base of the hill, heading towards home. As I came around, I felt like someone was watching me. You know that weird sixth sense where your hair stands up and you begin looking over your shoulders? Well, that. I looked up the hill to see the same black-clad figure. I'd never been this close to him and it's weird. I knew he wasn't real, like I knew it wasn't a real living person. I could see a small amount of exposed skin and it was grey and black, like a corpse. I shouted up to him and he just casually walked down the hill the opposite way. I waded up the hillside as fast as I could. Gone. Vanished. As if he'd never been there. No footprints, no disturbed snow. Not even a bit of fluff or fur from his garments. The corpse figure had gone. I haven't seen him since that last encounter, and I believe he is one of the skeletons buried in the ice tomb, which, if true, makes the fact that there's about 10 skeletons buried a stone's throw from my house even creepier. If that's at all possible. Hey guys, Brother Jackson here. Quite a long video for you this time. I really hope you enjoyed it. It's a big thank you for getting me to 1,000 subscribers. Hopefully I'll be back on the partner program soon and I'll be able to post community posts and where it's just like the text, let you know that I'm uploading new videos and stuff like that. And also hopefully my videos will be able to get monetized again. That's something that I'm excited for, obviously. I think I'll be able to start live streaming if that's something anybody's into. There's a few other bits and bobs like that. So thank you guys, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more. Peace.